I think it is time for some more Dartmoor stories, a place of pixies and witches and weirdness, and also great beauty and archaeological fascination, a place of artists, wilderness seekers and folklorists. Today I will tell you of a witch's curse, a river's mystery, a witchery hare, an ogre, and the Pixies' revenge on a local abbot. We go to Dartmoor, and many people may wonder why. Well, even before moving close by there, I had a fascination with moorlands, my nearest childhood one being Saddleworth Moor in the northwest of England. I get a strange, peculiar thrill when on moorlands. Something travels up through my feet. The land is speaking and telling its stories. On moving to Devon decades later, I found there was a wealth of collected folklore that is often missing from some of the other great British moorlands. Obviously other people had had this strange connection to Dartmoor, and then I met and married Marc, an artist hugely inspired by the moor, and its folklore, and its fairies, and we moved very close by, and our friendships with the moorland creative community grew, and I began to notice more and more that this same weird obsession runs through all of us. We have been captivated by Dartmoor. Now I know many of you can never travel there, but there are amazing channels on YouTube of wild campers and hikers and photographers who show the scenery beautifully. We can all walk across the moor or into the woodlands and by the rivers from the comfort of our own homes wherever we are in the world. Long may we all be able to promote and show Dartmoor at its finest, each in our own particular way. Without further ado, I present the next tales of haunting and strange Dartmoor. Nearby Hound Tor, that distinctive pile of granite rocks with its history of Conan Doyle and partly his inspiration for the Hound of the Baskervilles, is a very tall stack of granite called Bowerman's Nose. It stands surveying the countryside all around for miles, and from one angle you can see a face emerge from the silhouette of the granite. And this is what is left of Bowerman himself. Dartmoor was, and still is, a place of many witches, frightening ones once, whiter ones now, but this tale dates back to a time when the locals were terrified of the witches, and yet they needed them too. They could help heal the sick, help deliver babies, and help communities. It was a relationship of necessity, and the witches held the power. In these dark and distant times, living on the eastern side of the moor lived a moorland man known as Bowerman the Hunter, a tall, forbidding and strong man, a supreme hunter. It was his passion and his life. Bowerman's hunting hounds were renowned also, the most vicious and merciless during the hunt, and they never gave up pursuit of their prey. He became an arrogant man. Nobody could compare to him in the hunt, and no hounds could best his. He became famous and infamous all across the moor, and it was this arrogance that led to his downfall. The people lived in fear and respect of the moorland witches. They knew where these people would meet at their sabbats and moots, the strange places full of eerie sensations. These the people avoided as best they could, and yet Bowerman scoffed at their fear. He was afraid of no one, not even the devil himself, and there was no way he was going to be frightened of a bunch of old women with their so-called spells and nonsense. And as well as this, he encouraged the other moorland folk to stop being so superstitious of the hags. It was all rubbish. Now, Dartmoor is not a very large place, and eventually Bowerman's disrespect got back to the witches, who were furious, of course, and yet the coven of witches did have a real fear themselves of Bowerman. After all, his dogs were dreadful, and he himself was a powerful physical man. Without either party saying a word, a careful truce developed. Bowerman and the witches avoided each other, while both sides carried on with their business. It was an autumn day when Bowerman broke this uneasy truce. Heading home, his hounds flushed a large hare from her hiding place, and she took off across the hillside. With Bowerman's encouragement, his hounds took flight after it. They almost had the poor beast when it darted off to one side into a wooded valley. The dogs stopped confused, and then they picked up the scent once more, and they sped off through the trees with Bowerman running and leaping close behind. And then both hounds and man came to a clearing, and in this clearing was a coven of witches about their spellcraft. The hare leaped between the women, and following, regardless of who they harmed or hurt, leapt Bowerman and his dogs. The witches scattered to avoid injury, and now they were filled with rage and screaming in anger. Bowerman did not care. He had gone by then, still chasing the hare, and yet they screamed after him. After some time the women were calmed, still filled with rage, but deadly calm. They talked and came to the same conclusion. Bowerman had this time gone too far. His arrogance had caused them real physical harm. They would have revenge both swift and fierce. It was a thing that one of these witches had a peculiar gift, because this witch could transform herself into a hare, an unnatural thing, a witchery hare. It was decided a trap would be set for Bowerman, and she willingly agreed to be the bait. All they needed was to watch and wait for the return of the hunter. And so it came to be. He and his baying hounds were soon in their area. The sound of the hounds announced him before he could even be seen. All of the witches hid themselves and left the one witchery hare to take up her role. She allowed herself to be seen and smelled. The dogs picked up her scent, and the chase began. The hare led the hunter and hounds over hills, across tors, over the bogs and through the mires, through the woodlands and over the rivers, but they could not catch the hare. At last Bowerman and the dogs began to falter, exhausted, still chasing, but their spirits were numbed by now. They chased the hare up a steep ridge, and as they neared the top, the witchery hare stumbled. The dogs made to attack it. It was a ruse. The hare darted off behind a tor. Bowerman and the dogs pulled themselves together, and they began the chase once more, right into the witches' coven's trap. Behind the tor stood the coven, waiting. The witchery hare and many more witches who had come to lend their spellcraft and power. The hunter and the dogs stood in exhausted confusion as the witches began to circle, chanting and chanting. Bowerman found he could not move, and nor could his dogs, as the witches made circles around and around them all. The spell carried on, round and around the circle. Stronger and stronger the energy grew. Bowerman could not move. Bowerman could not breathe. And little by little he began to turn to stone, growing from the earth to the shape of a huge granite stack, and his dogs transforming to boulders all around him. All he could do from then was gaze with sightless eyes over the lands that he once hunted, and he is there to this very day. And on dark nights it is said that Bowerman can break his spell for the briefest of times and roam Hane down with his dogs, only to be returned to his stony state as the spell returns. Tavistock is one of the main towns of Dartmoor, a stannery town, one of the places that had officials who could give the seal of approval for the quality of the tin mined on the moor. It is a rather grand moorland town, extensive nowadays, but still would have been very grand and imposing at the time of this story. As with many Dartmoor places, there is a connection with monks, there once having been an abbey at the town, the remains of which can be seen to this day. And it was one of the bishops of this abbey that caused outrage among the Pixie folk of Dartmoor. This abbot was appalled at the belief of and respect for the Pixies by the moorland folk. To him this was against the will of God, a sin, especially the acts of leaving out gifts of food for the Pixies, or wearing charms of them for luck. He gave a list of punishments that must be carried out towards anyone acting in this way. The people were afraid of the bishop, even more so than of the Pixies, it seems. He could have the last say about who entered heaven or not. The Pixies soon came to hear about all of this. After all, Pixies miss nothing on Dartmoor. They decided to have their revenge on the foolish man and his abbey and stop this persecution. It was the abbey's dairy that felt the wrath of the Pixies first. All of a sudden the cream would not churn to butter, and the kitchens were next. As with all good churchgoers, these devout monks and the bishop would partake of fish on a Friday, fish which were caught on the moorland rivers and streams, where they were plump and plentiful. But now, no fish could even be seen. The Pixies had placed a spell of invisibility on them. Monks walking the moors would find themselves pixie-led, walking around and around in circles, lost in places that should be familiar. The monks complained to the abbot, but to him these things were irrelevant. After all, it wasn't he himself lost on the moors. Who cared? Tavistock Abbey was famous far and wide for its still room, where ale and cider could be made and stored. In fact, the abbey was renowned for all of the fine foods that the monks seemed to produce and devour, copious amounts every day. The cider was apparently a thing to wonder at, but it was the heather liqueur that was the pride of the abbey. Its creation was kept top secret from the ordinary folk. Special visitors would be offered the odd glass, and only 2 monks in the whole abbey ever knew the recipe and method of making this heavenly brew. The secret was passed down on the death of one of the monks or the other to the next person who would be the brewer. It was even kept a secret from the abbot. The abbot's obsession of his war with the Pixies was growing increasingly irrational, and at one meeting in the chapter house, he announced that not one single drop of heather wine would pass his lips until each and every Pixie had been driven from the moor. Only water would quench his thirst. The Pixies heard all of this also, of course, and that night one of the small creatures crept into the abbot's bedroom, and there he changed the water left out for the abbot into heather ale. The abbot took a swig of what he thought was water, astonished at the heather wine, and relishing its distinctive and wonderful taste. Maybe he had been too harsh with himself. He shouldn't have to do without the brew because of the Pixies. He was, of course, the abbot of Tavistock Abbey. He finished the glass and instantly craved another. He wandered down to the still room and sent the brewer of the still and cellar away. He must keep secret that he was not abiding by his own pronouncement. All of the servants left, and the monks, and the abbot began to help himself. One more glass was not enough, though. He drank another, and then another, and many, many more, until eventually he collapsed on the floor in a drunken stupor, out cold and snoring loudly. And of course the Pixies had watched all of this from secret corners, and now they arrived in the open to pull the abbot's ears and his nose and poke him hard and mercilessly, rougher and rougher, until the abbot began to rouse, and then they would soothe him delicately back to sleep, and then begin the torment again, and this went on, until eventually the abbot came round as much as he could and started swearing, cursing and screaming at the Pixies, first in Latin, and then in the coarsest English that even the lowliest servant could understand. Of course by now all and sundry from the abbey had come to see what on earth was going on. The day after, the abbot was extremely sheepish, not to say very hungover. He had been drunk and swearing, and had proven himself to be a liar who broke his vows. The news soon passed all over the parishes of Dartmoor. The abbot was a fool. He was a laughing-stock. The abbot was incensed. He would have greater revenge on the Pixies. The following day, a strange monk arrived who had travelled from the Holy Lands. The Pixies were not the main cause of this, in his opinion. This was an act of the devil himself and his temptations, and he told his opinion to the abbot. As far as he was concerned, the Pixies and the devil must be excommunicated. The abbot was delighted at this suggestion, and also that this man had provided him with an excuse. The devil made me do it. High Mass was held the following day, and each and every monk was in attendance. Every single corner was blessed with holy water, every nook and every cranny. And then they ran out of water, and they hurried to the well to get more, which they used to bless all of the grounds and the lands belonging to the abbey. And it worked. Not a single Pixie returned to the abbey, and fishing resumed, and the butter was churned, and the heather ale was there for all. The strange monk traveller could not be found anywhere, though. He had simply gone on his way. To protect the abbey from the Pixies' planned revenge this time, a huge granite cross was carved and set upon the edge of the abbey lands at Tavistock, and even to this day it is called the Pixies' Cross, and it stands on Whitchurch Common, which is now a golf course. For our next tale we head to Sharptor, and a lonely but beautiful farm called Robrock Farm that sits beneath the Tor, close to the haunting River Dart that tumbles and bubbles as it falls over rocks and boulders of the gorge nearby. And some have said that it sometimes sounds like a human calling from the river, or maybe the spirit of the Dart itself. It is a thing, you know, the spirit of the Dart. Living at the farm was a young man, a farmhand whose job it was to tend and care for the cows and bullocks. The tale told is set in winter. The farmers were huddled around the kitchen table, food eaten and the conversation turning to the events of the day, the usual banter and gossip. Suddenly the boy burst into the room in a panic. Someone was down by the river calling for help. The farmhands dragged themselves from the warmth of the kitchen and made their way carefully through the cold winter's night across the land and down to the River Dart. And yet all that could be heard was the river itself, and the call of tawny owls roosting high in the trees. The farm workers scoffed at the boy. He must have thought the river and the owls were a human voice. And then another sound joined the owls, and the rushing water. A faint human voice that called, "Jan Coo! Jan Coo!" The men peered into the darkness, confused and frightened. They began to search, calling back into the darkness, "Where was the person? Do you need help?" The voice stopped at this, only the owls and the river's sound remaining. One man, a shepherd, called for another, the ploughman, to run to the farm and fetch a lantern. The man did this, and on his return they all searched in vain, but there was nobody there. They pulled themselves together, shivering at the cold and the strangeness, and returned to the farm. Next night the same thing happened. The lad ran into the room in distress. The voice was back. They decided this time to simply stand in the farmyard and listen from there. This time all could hear the voice calling from the river, "Jan Coo! Jan Coo! Jan Coo!" They all called out, and yet once again there was no response. The men suspected pixies, and at this they shuddered, and returned to the safety of the farm, the fireside, and locked the door firmly behind themselves. Time passed. Winter turned to early spring, and the hedgerow flowers were starting to poke their heads from the late snows and icy earth. A freshness in the air, and a pale sun in the skies over the moor. One evening the cowherd and his friend Abel were travelling back to the farm. They had crossed over Sharp Tor and were heading down the slopes. And then the voice again, after all this time, "Jan Coo! Jan Coo! Jan Coo!" Louder this time and more urgent, coming from Langamarsh Pit. The lad shouted back, "Jan Coo! Jan Coo! Jan Coo!" And this time the voice replied, repeating the same back to him again and again. The lad looked to his friend. It must be him that was wanted. Abel should go to the farm, and he wouldn't be long following him after. He would just go and see if he could find an answer to the mystery. He bounded off, past the boulders and down the hill, towards the River Dart. Abel could even see his friend pick his way over the river and heading to the pit where the voice still called. And all at once he was lost sight of. Abel carried on to the farm, still hearing that calling voice, calling his friend. At the farm Abel lifted the latch of the front door, and at that second the voice stopped. Silence, eerie and forbidding, fell. Inside the farm, workers were already sat waiting for their food after a long hard day in the fields, and they welcomed Abel, and he explained where his friend had gone. They agreed he would be back and be able to tell them who or what was the cause of the strange voice. But hours passed, and the ticking clock ominously marked the passing time. The lad had not returned hours later, and by now all of the household were worried. They rose and they gathered lanterns and ropes and readied a pony. They headed to Langamarsh Pit, praying they would find the lad, and praying they would not need the pony to drag him or what was left of him out of the marsh. But they found nothing. He had completely vanished. Could it be the pixies, or the river spirit, the spirit of the Dart? And to this day his body was never found, and to this day the voice never called for Jan Coo again. The spirit of the Dart still holds a fear for many in Devon though, all the way from its birth on Dartmoor to where it meets the sea at Dartmouth. And there is a small poem still used today in that very part of Devon that tells of how every year the river will take a life in sacrifice, surely a memory of a time much older. River Dart, every year thou claim'st a heart. We travel back to Tavistock again for this next tale, where once lived one of Dartmoor's many, many witches, and with her lived her grandson. Theirs was a typical Devon cottage, mud and wattle and daub walls, thick and solid, standing heavy on the earth, and topped with a thatched roof of reeds, not unlike our own old cottage when we lived in Devon. The moorland folk knew of her reputation. She knew spells and magic, both dark and light. Sometimes they needed her help, but other than that they kept a respectful distance. This particular witch had one spell that she was renowned for, because she was a witch who could transform into a hare, as could the one who helped trick Bowerman in the story before. Maybe it was the same witch. The witch and her grandson had developed a plan to help them get by in their poverty. The lad would go to the local manor and ask to see the squire, who had a great love of hunting and had a very famous pack of hunting dogs. The boy would always tell the squire that he had seen a huge hare in the fields, perfect for hunting and fat for eating. The squire would gather his dogs and grab his gun and head out to hunt the hare, tipping the lad a little money as he left. And the lad would then run straight back to the grandma's and wait for her to return when she had finished her part of the ruse. And this is how they made a little money from the squire to keep a little extra food on the table. Once the squire was out in the fields, the witchery hare would wait for the dogs to get near, and then she would set off, over hills, down the valleys, through the dangerous marshlands, over the rocky tors, through the ancient woodlands. They would return to the manor exhausted and defeated. Not once did the squire and his dogs even get close to the hare. It was almost as though there was something uncanny about it. And it was this thought that grew and grew in the squire's mind, because it made no sense. The faster the dogs ran, the quicker the hare sped away. And how come that same lad always turned up before the weird hare and the fruitless hunt? And so the squire put the word about that he was looking for a particular boy, and eventually word got back to him of who the boy was and where he lived, and who he lived with, the witch. The squire left his usual routine for a while and set men to watching the witch's cottage, and it wasn't long before one of the men returned to the manor with news of who and what they had seen there. The witch and her grandson had left the cottage together and were heading over to the manor house. The squire prepared himself and his dogs and waited, knowing what was about to happen. As usual, the unsuspecting boy arrived at the manor and asked to see the squire. The boy came, gave his message, was given a sixpence, and he left. The squire, though, was already ready this time, and had been waiting. So he was able to rush quickly to the field, quicker than the witch expected. This time the hare panicked at seeing the hounds waiting for her. They almost grabbed her. She shot under the gate and sped away. The hounds and the squire gained on the hare closer and closer, heading towards the cottage. Once there, the hare dodged the baying hounds and slipped through a gap under the door of the cottage. The hounds paced back and forth, their voices filling the air and their claws scratching at the wood. The squire arrived and banged at the cottage door, demanding the old woman come out, but all that met this demand was silence. He heaved himself at the door, but it did not move. By now a small group of people had come to see what the noise was. The squire turned to one and told him to head to Tavistock, fetch the parson and the parish constable, and get back as quickly as possible. When they returned, the constable banged on the door, and slowly it opened. The old woman stood there asking whatever was wrong. They accused her of witchcraft, and she denied everything. The squire threatened to let his dogs loose on her, and she broke down sobbing and confessed. The old woman and her grandson begged for mercy, crying dreadfully, her grandson pleading for his grandmother's life. Eventually she promised to give up the craft, never cast another spell, and she would even attend the local church on Sundays. The crowd decided that they would spare her. She had one chance to repent and change her ways. The squire was not happy, though. He would have his vengeance. He would give her a whipping in punishment. The woman meekly submitted. He had his way, and she was left on the floor, writhing in pain. Yet this was sadly not the end of the story. The witch returned to her ways, for how else could she and her grandson survive? She didn't transform to a hare anymore, but the local folk told of many wicked things that she had done. Finally, they had had enough. The old woman was arrested as a witch. At trial, she was found guilty and eventually put to death, and her grandson banished from the moor forever. A sad tale indeed, and yet a typical one of the time. In the lovely town of Ashburton, on the edge of Dartmoor, are many old buildings, cafes, pubs and galleries, and this is set in beautiful countryside. It is, like Tavistock, one of the Dartmoor stannery towns, so it would have had special standing on the moor. Now, in the centre of Ashburton is a bridge over what was called the River Yeo, now the Ashburn, and this is called the King's Bridge. And it is here that the town was plagued by a dreadful water spirit, Cutty Dyer. Cutty Dyer was a monstrous fairy creature, and like many water spirits he would take the lives of unwary travellers or those who would come to the banks of the river, and his favourite victims were children, naughty ones, especially little boys. He would tempt them to the water's edge with his magic, drag them in and eat them. Adults were not safe either. Many lost their lives to Cutty Dyer as they made their way home from the local pubs. There is a tale told by the wonderful Dartmoor historian and folklorist William Crossing of two men who had been carefully walking along the river one night. Behind them was Ashburton, the town silent in its slumber. Only their own footsteps and the odd word between them broke the silence. Their way was a winding one, tripping a little, weaving around. It was obvious that the two men had enjoyed one or two drinks at the pubs in town. Every so often they would stop and argue about which way was the right way home. And it was during one of these arguments that one of them stopped and yelled, "Cutty Dyer!" His friend grabbed his arm and they both stared towards the same point. There, in the middle of the river, stood a huge figure, water dripping from the cloth that covered it, great goggle eyes flashing, black snake-like locks of hair twisting down from its huge head, and a beard the same hanging down to its belt. Nothing of the face was visible, except those menacing bright eyes, and teeth that were sharp and pointed. The men froze in terror. The figure came closer, closer, reaching out one great hand. They just could not move, and then the hand of Cutty Dyer touched one of the men's shoulders. And at that, the spell of fear was broken. The men screamed and ran and staggered from the riverbank. Did Cutty Dyer intend to kill and eat them? We will never know. The two men were still alive the next day, one collapsed and sleeping in a stranger's cucumber frame covered in glass, and the other woke to find himself in the local jail as he had assaulted the constable the night before. So there we have more Dartmoor tales. Trust me, there are many, many more, and I will tell those as time goes on now and then. However, for now, dear friends, keep well, take care, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.